there, it's me, SpongeBob. Welcome to Sleepy Sponge Lore, a place where the secrets of Bikini Bottom drift like dreams beneath the waves. So take a deep breath, get comfy, and let the ocean carry you to sleep. Let the video begin.
It began with a hush. The sea, at certain hours, seemed to breathe differently, a long, slow rhythm, as though it too needed rest. In the quiet folds of that rhythm, where the water pressed soft against coral and sand, there lay something that did not belong. Not a treasure chest, not a pearl, not even some relic of long-lost sailors. It was humbler, stranger, and in its way a little miraculous. A reef blower. It rested crookedly in the sand, part buried, as if the ocean itself wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Its shape caught the light unevenly, throwing little gleams into the rippling water. At times it almost looked alive, the way the shadows slipped around its frame. And though no one else noticed it, one sponge, small, square, and endlessly curious, felt a tug toward it, as if some unseen current had whispered his name. SpongeBob often wandered like this, with no grand mission, no pressing goal. Just the soft pull of wonder guiding his steps. His feet pressed tiny marks into the sand as he moved, and his wide eyes searched the reef as if it were all new, every day, every moment. That morning, he had set out looking for nothing in particular. And perhaps because of that, he found something extraordinary. He stood before the reef blower, tilting his head as though listening for a secret. To anyone else, it might have seemed dull, even broken. But SpongeBob did not see things the way others did. Where Squidward saw mess, SpongeBob saw possibility. Where Patrick saw snacks, SpongeBob saw stars. Where most creatures would walk past a half-buried machine, SpongeBob felt it might carry a song. He touched it carefully, brushing off a thin layer of sand. His fingers traced the cool surface. The machine was quiet, but not silent. It held the stillness of something waiting. And that was when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like the echo of a sound. A hum that wasn't there and yet was. The kind of thing you can't explain, only feel. Like remembering a lullaby without the words, or sensing a storm long before the clouds arrive. It was soft, mysterious, almost comforting. SpongeBob pressed his cheek against the metal the way a child presses an ear to a shell, hoping to hear the ocean. Instead of waves, he felt a vibration deep inside, not moving yet, but alive. It was as though the reef blower was holding its breath, waiting for someone who might understand. He smiled, the kind of smile that comes when something ordinary suddenly feels like magic. Perhaps it was because SpongeBob had always been a little different. As a child, he lingered on things that others brushed aside. He liked the way bubbles rose, the way seagrass swayed when no one was looking, the way silence could feel full instead of empty. Other children darted around, chasing currents, while SpongeBob knelt in the sand, watching how a pebble glowed when light caught it just right. To him, the world was never just what it was. It was what it could be, and so, the reef blower did not appear broken to him. It appeared lonely. The ocean whispered around him, a soft chorus of currents and fish fins. SpongeBob sat beside the machine, cross-legged, watching it as if it might speak. Hours could pass this way for him, and he would not notice. To others, it was aimless. To SpongeBob, it was communion. He thought about how objects could have moods, just as people did. Squidward's clarinet had moods. Sometimes its notes wandered sadly, sometimes they curled like smoke, sometimes they sighed. Why shouldn't a reef blower too carry moods of its own? A breeze stirred the sea floor, shifting a thin veil of sand across the blower's frame. SpongeBob reached out, brushing it away again, gently, reverently. He almost whispered, "There, that's better," though no one was listening. Except, perhaps, the blower. And in that moment, something shifted. A bubble rose from the machine's side, drifting upward in a lazy spiral. It was nothing, just a trapped pocket of air, released after who knows how long. But SpongeBob's eyes lit up as though he had witnessed a miracle. He laughed softly, the kind of laugh you release when no one else will understand. It was enough for him to believe that this machine was not empty. That, like himself, it carried something unspoken. The reef blower didn't roar to life that day. It didn't suddenly grant him powers or perform wonders. It only sat there, quiet, humming its invisible hum, and SpongeBob sat with it as though keeping vigil. And maybe that was the true beginning. Not the moment of noise, but the moment of noticing. Because stories don't always begin with thunder. Sometimes they begin with someone willing to listen to silence. As the day stretched on, SpongeBob traced patterns in the sand. He imagined the blower's hum as a melody, one that wrapped around him like a blanket. The reef seemed to slow, as though lulled by the same rhythm. Even the fish that darted by paused, curious, then swam gently onward. He thought of Squidward then. How his neighbor always grew irritated when SpongeBob lingered too long, too cheerfully. He wondered if Squidward would scoff at the idea that a reef blower could carry moods, or that a sponge could befriend a machine. He imagined the frown, the sigh, the sharp words. Yet, beneath that, SpongeBob also imagined Squidward listening, late at night when no one else was awake, just listening, and maybe hearing it too. The thought made him smile. When the sky above the ocean dimmed to a softer blue, SpongeBob rose slowly. He brushed the sand from his legs and looked once more at the machine. It looked as it always had, crooked, quiet, half forgotten. And yet, to him, it was no longer just a thing. It was a beginning. He placed a small shell on top of it like an offering, or perhaps a promise. Then he whispered, "I'll be back tomorrow," though the machine gave no sign it heard. Still, SpongeBob walked away lighter, as if something in him had been answered. That night, as he settled into his bed beneath the pineapple roof, he thought of the reef blower waiting quietly. He thought of its invisible hum, the one only he seemed to feel. His eyes grew heavy, his breaths slow, and he drifted into sleep with the faint impression of that sound. Not loud, not urgent, just steady like the tide itself, and in the dark. Somewhere beneath the waves the reef blower sat, humming softly, as though it too was waiting for the days to come. Childhood is not always remembered in straight lines. It lingers more like a dream, with some moments sharp as shells and others soft as sand, blurred by the passing tide. SpongeBob's childhood was like that. A patchwork of odd little moments that never quite added up in other people's eyes, but in his they shone with quiet wonder. He had always been different. That was clear from the beginning. Other children darted around the playground reef, chasing jellyfish and tumbling in games of tag. SpongeBob was often found crouched low, not chasing, but watching. He would press his hands into the sand, lifting them slowly, just to see how the grains shifted between his fingers. Sometimes he would place a bubble wand into the water and simply watch the bubbles drift, fascinated by how they always rose, no matter what. The others teased him gently at first. They laughed when he lingered too long over something as ordinary as a pebble, or when he asked questions that seemed to have no answers. Why does light bend when it touches water? Do starfish dream of the same stars we see? What if every grain of sand had its own story? Most children shook their heads and swam away, chasing louder distractions. SpongeBob stayed behind, tracing circles in the sand, humming to himself in a voice no one else cared to hear. But oddness has its gifts. One of SpongeBob's earliest memories was sitting in his grandmother's lap as she knitted. Her hands moved with a rhythm that was both precise and soothing, the thread looping and unlooping like waves against a shore. He didn't always understand the patterns, but he felt their meaning. "Every stitch holds a little care," she had whispered to him once. "Even if it looks small, it matters." That line stayed with him. He began to notice stitches everywhere, in the way seagrass wove with the current, in the way coral branches grew around one another, in the way even silence could feel like something stitched gently between moments of sound. His friends sometimes thought him scatterbrained, but really, SpongeBob was simply attuned to things others didn't pause to see. He had a way of giving attention to what was overlooked, the unnoticed ripple, the tiny shell half buried, the hum that wasn't quite there. Even as a child, he practiced kindness in quiet ways. Once, when a classmate's lunch drifted off into the current, SpongeBob chased it down, not for glory, but because he couldn't bear the thought of someone going hungry. Another time, when a jellyfish got tangled in seaweed, he carefully untangled its delicate tendrils, whispering, "There you go," as though the creature could hear. He wasn't strong, nor fast, nor especially clever in the ways others measured, but he was gentle. And gentleness, while often mistaken for weakness, was in fact a kind of strength, though SpongeBob did not know that yet. What he did know was that he often felt out of step. There were days when he tried to join the games, to laugh as loudly as the others, to tumble and race and shout. But sooner or later his attention wandered. He found himself staring at the curve of a seashell, or at the way Patrick, even then his closest friend, laughed with his whole body, as if joy itself lived in him. SpongeBob noticed these things deeply, and in noticing them he sometimes forgot to keep up with the crowd. Teachers shook their heads. "Bright enough," they would say, "but distracted." Neighbors smiled tolerantly. "That sponge has his head in the clouds," they murmured, though there were no clouds underwater. Even Squidward, who had lived near him since those days, often rolled his eyes at SpongeBob's constant enthusiasm for what seemed trivial. But to SpongeBob, nothing was trivial. He remembered the way he used to collect tiny shells, not because they were rare, but because each one seemed to carry a personality. Some were shy, hiding in spirals. Some were bold, opening wide. He arranged them in rows, whispered greetings to them, and sometimes even fell asleep with one held close, like a charm. His oddness was not always easy. There were evenings when he sat alone on the sand, watching the others drift away together, their voices fading into the distance. He felt a pang, a hollow place, as though his gentleness had no place in a world that wanted speed and noise. Yet even then he held to the small comforts, the glow of the moonlight on water, the hum of distant currents, the certainty that everything, no matter how quiet, had meaning, and it was in those moments of quiet that something inside him stretched. Perhaps it was the beginning of what would later shape his whole life, this ability to linger, to notice, to give heart to what seemed ordinary. While others hurried, SpongeBob was learning patience. While others demanded attention, he was learning to listen. And while others sought excitement, he was learning to find wonder in the humblest things. Patrick understood, at least in part. Even as children, the starfish seemed to drift naturally into SpongeBob's orbit. Patrick never mocked him for staring too long at a bubble or for talking softly to a snail. Instead, Patrick joined him, lying side by side in the sand, staring upward as though the ceiling of the sea were an endless sky. "What if we never stop floating?" Patrick once murmured. SpongeBob didn't have an answer, but he smiled, because sometimes just asking the question was enough. And so SpongeBob's childhood became a collection of odd, tender moments stitched together, small acts, unnoticed by most but deeply shaping him. A dropped toy he carefully returned, a cracked shell he kept because it was still beautiful, a reef blower not yet found, waiting somewhere in the distance of his story. He didn't know then how these quirks would guide him, how they would form the quiet strength of his adulthood. He only knew that he felt the world differently. And though it set him apart, it also set him on a path no one else could walk. Oddness, after all, is just another word for uniqueness. And sometimes it is the odd ones who carry the gentlest wisdom. That night, when he lay in his small bed, SpongeBob thought about the day's moments, the laughter of friends, the frown of a teacher, the shimmer of a shell he had tucked beneath his pillow. His eyes closed slowly, and his last thought was a soft one, a child's prayer not for greatness, but for kindness, and in the quiet, as sleep folded over him, the ocean outside hummed gently, as though it too believed in the small, odd sponge who saw the world differently. Morning came gently. The ocean always had its own way of waking, not with alarm bells or hurried feet, but with soft light filtering through the water, drifting downward like threads of gold. Fish stirred slowly, stretching their fins as though reluctant to leave the dreams of night. The coral yawned with colour, opening itself to the day, and among it all, SpongeBob stirred too, blinking into the soft glow, already feeling the pull of yesterday's discovery. He didn't rush through breakfast that morning. He hummed softly as he buttered his toast, poured himself a glass of kelp juice, and glanced at the clock, though he didn't need to. His mind was elsewhere, not on work, not on errands, but on the reef blower. It had waited quietly for who knows how long, and somehow he couldn't bear to keep it waiting any longer. The walk toward the reef felt shorter than usual. His legs bounced, his arms swinging with that familiar, innocent eagerness. And yet, under the eagerness, there was something gentler, a kind of reverence, as though he wasn't just walking to a machine, but approaching something sacred, something that had already begun to whisper into his heart. When he reached the place where it lay, the reef blower looked unchanged, crooked, quiet, half sunken in the sand, its metal dull with time. But SpongeBob saw it differently now. To him, it had a presence, like a sleeping creature, one that only needed a kind touch to stir. He knelt beside it, brushing sand from the surface as though tucking a blanket away from a face. "Good morning," he whispered, not expecting an answer. And of course there was none, only the hush of water, the faint chatter of distant clams. But SpongeBob was not discouraged. He turned the blower over gently, inspecting it the way a child inspects a toy, curious and tender. Its knobs and levers looked strange but inviting. There was a pull cord resting awkwardly at the side, its handle worn from use. SpongeBob touched it lightly, feeling the smoothness where countless hands might have pulled before. He hesitated. For a long moment he simply sat there, cord in hand, listening to the silence around him. He wasn't afraid exactly, just thoughtful. He wondered what would happen when he pulled it. Would it roar? Would it sputter and cough? Would it fail altogether, proving that his belief in its hum was just imagination? But deep down he trusted, so he pulled. At first, nothing. The cord slid back with a dull thump. SpongeBob's smile faltered, but only slightly. He tried again, a little firmer this time. The machine gave a cough, a small rattle that seemed more sigh than sound. A bubble drifted upward, breaking into the still water. SpongeBob's eyes widened. He tried once more, steady this time, patient. The cord tugged, the blower shuddered, and then slowly, reluctantly, it gave its first breath. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even strong. Just a soft exhale, like a flute note half played. Sand lifted gently from the ground, swirling in a delicate spiral before settling again. It was enough to change the water's texture, to make the silence hum. SpongeBob laughed, but not loudly. More like a breath escaping, a child marveling at the simplest trick. His eyes glowed as he placed his hands on the machine, steadying it as though comforting a nervous animal. "There you are," he whispered. "I knew you could." The blower hummed faintly, uncertain, like someone waking from a long sleep. Its breath stirred the sand again, revealing a patch of smooth stone beneath. To anyone else, it was just a patch of clean floor. To SpongeBob, it was proof that even something forgotten could still bring clarity, still uncover hidden beauty. He let the machine rest, then tried again, finding a rhythm. Pull, shudder, breath. Each time the exhale grew a little stronger, a little steadier. The sand danced in soft patterns, shells shifting slightly as though drawn into a slow waltz. It was not chaos, but art. And SpongeBob felt something stir in himself. He realized in that moment that the blower was not just a tool. It was a companion. It responded to him in its way, not with words, not even with clear intent, but with presence. He gave it patience and it gave him breath. He gave it trust and it gave him song. As he worked, Squidward passed by in the distance, frowning as usual. He stopped for a moment, peering at SpongeBob's antics with the blower. To Squidward it must have looked ridiculous. A sponge crouched in the sand, grinning at a sputtering machine. He shook his head, muttering something about nonsense before walking away. But SpongeBob hardly noticed. He wasn't doing this for Squidward. He wasn't doing this for anyone, really. He was doing it because the reef blower had called to him, and because in answering, he felt whole. Minutes stretched into hours, though SpongeBob didn't feel the time pass. He watched the sand clear in circles, watched the blower's breath uncover tiny shells and polish stones. Each discovery felt like a gift, a little reminder that even the hidden and the ordinary had their beauty. When at last the blower quieted, too tired to breathe more, SpongeBob didn't feel disappointed. He simply rested beside it, patting its side affectionately. "Good work," he murmured, as though to a friend. The machine sat silent again, but the hum still lingered in his heart, faint but steady. As he walked home that evening, the water around him seemed changed. Not louder, not brighter, but fuller. He noticed how the kelp swayed in time with the current, how bubbles rose with such certainty, how even Squidward's clarinet, faint in the distance, seemed to blend with the day's rhythm. SpongeBob realized then that it wasn't just the reef blower that had breathed. It was him too. Something in him had stretched wider, softened deeper, become more alive, and as he lay in bed that night, the thought lulled him into sleep, that even the quietest breath, the smallest hum, could awaken a world of meaning. The reef blower dreamed too, perhaps if machines can dream, dreamed of sand and shells and the gentle hands of a sponge who believed in it enough to listen. And so, the first breath was not the end. It was the beginning. Every story of belonging has its shadows, and for SpongeBob, one of those shadows was Squidward. Not a cruel shadow, not a dangerous one, but the kind that always hovered nearby, sighing, frowning, reminding him that joy was not always easily shared. Squidward had lived next door for as long as SpongeBob could remember. Their houses stood like two mismatched notes in a song, SpongeBob's pineapple bright and cheerful, Squidward's stone-faced tall and stern. The very sight of them together was almost comical, like two clams arguing about the color of the tide. To SpongeBob, Squidward was a mystery. He carried himself stiffly, arms often folded, eyes half-lidded as though perpetually unimpressed. His clarinet wove strange music through the evenings, sometimes plaintive, sometimes sharp, but always marked with a yearning SpongeBob didn't fully understand. He admired Squidward in a way for being so sure of what he liked and didn't like. Yet, SpongeBob also longed for Squidward to see the world as he saw it, to laugh with him, to share in the delight of small things. The reef blower, of course, was bound to complicate things. It began with a simple act. SpongeBob, eager to test his new companion, guided the blower toward his own yard. Sand swirled and lifted, shells shifted into tidy rows, and for a while he was lost in the rhythm of it. The blower breathed gently, and SpongeBob felt proud, as though he had taught it a little dance. But then, as often happens, the current carried more than he intended. A stray shell, light as a whisper, drifted across the invisible line between their yards and landed with a soft clink in Squidward's neatly raked sand. Squidward noticed immediately. From his window, he peered out with a furrowed brow, clarinet still in hand. He watched SpongeBob with that familiar mix of disbelief and irritation, then flung open his door. SpongeBob, his voice, sharp and weary, cut through the hum of the blower.
"What in the ocean are you doing now?"
SpongeBob froze, cheeks puffing with nervous laughter.
"Just cleaning, Squidward. Making things nice and tidy." "Nice and tidy?"
Squidward huffed, pointing toward the misplaced shell. "That doesn't look tidy to me."
"That looks like chaos."
"Do you mind keeping your chaos on your side of the yard?" SpongeBob's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He turned off the blower, scooped up the shell, and placed it carefully back in his own sand. "There," he said softly, as though returning something precious. "All tidy again?" Squidward muttered, shaking his head, and retreated into his house, the clarinet resuming its mournful tune. Most neighbors would have been discouraged. Most would have grown defensive or resentful. But SpongeBob was not most neighbors. To him, Squidward's irritation wasn't the end of a connection. It was part of it. He sensed, beneath the sharpness, something softer. A loneliness Squidward didn't know how to express. And so instead of growing distant, SpongeBob leaned closer. Day after day, he worked with the blower, always careful now, always mindful of Squidward's boundaries. Yet somehow, no matter how cautious he was, little accidents happened. A puff of sand drifted too far. A bubble floated across. Once the blower startled a jellyfish that drifted right into Squidward's yard, hovering awkwardly outside his door, until Squidward shooed it away with a broom. Each time, Squidward grew more exasperated. Each time, SpongeBob apologized earnestly, not with sarcasm, but with real regret. And each time, after Squidward stormed back inside, SpongeBob whispered to the blower, "He doesn't mean it. He just wants peace." What Squidward never knew was that SpongeBob often cleaned his yard, too. Quietly, when Squidward wasn't looking, he guided the blower toward the edges, smoothing out lines, setting shells back in order. He didn't do it for thanks, he knows. In fact, he never told Squidward at all. He did it because caring for SpongeBob wasn't something that needed recognition. It was enough just to give it. Sometimes, in the evenings, SpongeBob sat outside after the blower's work was done, listening to Squidward's clarinet drift through the water. The notes wavered, uncertain, yet they carried something that made SpongeBob pause. It wasn't happiness, but it wasn't emptiness either. It was longing. He didn't always understand the longing, but he respected it. And, in a quiet way, he thought of the blower's hum as an answer to Squidward's song. One voice sighing, the other breathing, both of them neighbors to each other in the endless sea. One evening, Squidward surprised him. After a long day of SpongeBob's humming and the blower's sighs, Squidward opened his door and simply stood there, clarinet in hand.
"Do you ever stop?"
he asked, not angrily, but almost tiredly. SpongeBob blinked, then smiled softly.
"I guess no, not really. I just like to keep going."
"It makes me happy." Squidward stared for a moment as though searching for words. Then he shook his head with a sigh. "Well, try to be a little quieter, will you?" It wasn't kindness, not really. But it wasn't cruelty either. It was something in between, something SpongeBob cherished more than Squidward realized. For in that moment, Squidward had admitted he noticed him, that he existed not just as noise, but as part of his world. SpongeBob nodded gently. "I'll try, Squidward." And he meant it. As the days passed, the rhythm continued. SpongeBob and his blower, Squidward and his clarinet. One humming, one sighing. One cheerful, one weary. Two lives brushing against each other, never fully in harmony, yet never fully apart. And somewhere in that delicate tension, SpongeBob felt a quiet kind of bond. Not friendship, not yet, but something softer. The way two notes, though clashing, still belong to the same song. That night, as SpongeBob lay in bed, he thought about Squidward's sigh, his clarinet's longing. He thought about how annoyance, too, was a kind of connection, a sign that one life touched another, and he smiled, drifting into dreams with the thought that even irritation could carry meaning if you chose to hear it gently. And so the reef blower's breath was not just cleaning the sand, it was stitching threads between neighbors, messy, imperfect, but real. There is a rhythm to every friendship. Sometimes it is spoken in words, sometimes in laughter, and sometimes in silence. But with the reef blower, SpongeBob discovered another kind of rhythm, one woven not from sentences or songs, but from hums, sighs, and quiet movements of air. From the very first day, SpongeBob felt that the blower had its own way of speaking. It never used words, of course. It had no mouth, no voice like Squidward or Patrick. Yet whenever SpongeBob pulled the cord and the machine exhaled, he sensed intention. The way it pushed sand, the way bubbles rose, the way its hose curved like a guiding hand. All of it felt like speech. Only hidden beneath currents and vibrations, he decided one evening to listen more carefully. The sun had slipped behind the coral towers, painting the sea in shades of deep blue and violet. The town was settling down, Squidward's clarinet groaning faintly, Patrick already snoring in the distance. SpongeBob sat cross-legged beside the blower, his hand resting gently on its handle. "Tell me something," he whispered. "Anything at all." For a moment there was nothing.
Only the gentle hush of the tide.
Then, as though in answer, a single bubble drifted from the blower's mouth. It rose slowly, wobbling as though uncertain, until it broke the surface with a soft pop. SpongeBob smiled. "That's something." From then on, he treated every movement of the machine as a kind of conversation. A long sigh meant it was tired. A sudden puff meant excitement. When it hummed smoothly, he imagined it was content, and when it rattled, he thought of it as a complaint, the way Squidward muttered when his day was interrupted. The blower became, in SpongeBob's mind, more than a tool. It was a companion, a partner in the small rituals of life. He spoke to it the way others spoke to pets, or even to dear friends, not because he believed it truly understood him, though sometimes he wondered, but because the act of speaking brought warmth to his heart. "Do you like the way the sand looks now?" he would ask, as he guided the hose across the yard. The blower would answer with a steady hum, and SpongeBob would nod.
"I think so too."
Nice and neat. Squidward might not admit it, but I think he notices. Other times he shared secrets. Nothing large, nothing dark, but little confessions that weighed gently on him. "Sometimes I feel like Squidward doesn't like me at all," he admitted one afternoon, setting the blower down. "But that's okay.
I still like him."
Maybe one day he'll see I mean well." The blower's hose curved, brushing against his foot as though in reassurance. SpongeBob laughed softly, rubbing its side.
"Thanks, you always understand."
It was in those quiet talks that he realized something important. Machines could be friends too, if you allowed them to be. They might not have hearts that beat or minds that dreamed, but they held a kind of presence. They offered constancy, reliability, a rhythm you could trust.
And wasn't that in some way a form of care?
In time, SpongeBob began to notice details he hadn't before. The way the motor purred differently, depending on how tightly he held the handle. The subtle vibration that rose when the blower was excited, or perhaps just working harder than usual. He even thought he detected moods, the way others claimed to hear tones in voices. Once, when the blower sputtered unexpectedly, SpongeBob tilted his head.
"Oh, you don't like this spot? Too much sand?"
He moved to another patch, and the blower purred again, as if in approval. "See? We understand each other," he said proudly. To outsiders it might have looked silly. To Squidward, no doubt, it was nonsense. But to SpongeBob it was real. The blower spoke in its own language, and he had learned to listen. In a way, it reminded him of jellyfish. They too didn't use words, but through their movements, their pulses, their drifting dances, they expressed feelings. Joy, caution, curiosity. Machines, SpongeBob thought, were no different. You only had to quiet yourself enough to hear them. And so he did. On some days, he sat in silence, hand resting on the blower, eyes closed, breathing in time with its motor. The hum soothed him like a lullaby without words. On other days, he chattered endlessly, filling the air with stories while the blower answered in sighs and gentle pushes of sand. The conversations became a kind of ritual, a way to ground himself, a reminder that even in a busy world where not everyone understood him, he could always return to this machine, this companion, and feel heard. One evening, Patrick wandered by, curious. "Hey, SpongeBob, who are you talking to?" SpongeBob looked up with wide eyes, then smiled. "The blower." Patrick tilted his head. "Oh," he blinked. "Does it talk back?" "In its own way," SpongeBob said softly, almost defensively. "You just have to listen." Patrick squinted at the machine, then shrugged. "Cool," he said simply, before drifting off to chase a jellyfish. It didn't matter to SpongeBob whether others understood. It only mattered that he did. The reef blower had given him something precious, not just tidy sand, but the sense that even the quietest voices in the world deserved to be heard. That night, lying in bed, he thought about voices. Squidward's clarinet, Patrick's laughter, the jellyfish's gentle buzz, and now the blower's steady hum. Together they formed a chorus of different languages, each unique, each valid. SpongeBob drifted into dreams with a simple thought. Every being, every thing, had its own way of speaking, and friendship perhaps was nothing more than learning how to listen. Every morning, before the sun fully pierced the waters above, SpongeBob rose with the same simple thought. Today, I'll make it perfect. He would pad out into the soft light, his square feet pressing tiny prints into the sand. There, waiting faithfully, was the reef blower. Sometimes it glistened faintly with a sheen of salt water, as though it had been awake all night, waiting for him. Sometimes it seemed to hum even before he pulled its cord, eager to begin their daily ritual. The moment he set it into motion, the whole yard came alive. Sand swirled in arcs of soft gold, drifting and settling again like snowflakes. Seashells skittered across the ground until they found their place. Small bits of coral dust lifted away, leaving the surface smooth, unbroken, like a sheet of paper waiting for its first line. To SpongeBob, it was more than tidying. It was prayer. It was a way of saying the world can be made gentle, if only for a moment. Day after day, he perfected the craft. He learned how to tilt the hose so the grains fell evenly, how to nudge a shell into just the right hollow, how to erase every trace of yesterday's disorder. He even began to name patterns: the morning spiral, the sunset sweep. The sand became a canvas, and the blower his brush. At first, it felt like joy. He would stand back, hands on his hips, and sigh contentedly.
"There," he'd whisper, "just right." But perfection is a tender thing, and once it has settled into the heart, it rarely stays still. SpongeBob began to notice things he hadn't before.
A shell tilted slightly off-center, a line in the sand too faint, too uneven. He would spend extra minutes, then extra hours, smoothing and re-smoothing, rearranging and readjusting. What had once been play became pursuit. Squidward, of course, noticed first. One afternoon, Squidward stepped outside, arms folded, clarinet tucked beneath his arm. His yard was buried in sand again, blown there by one of SpongeBob's more ambitious sunrise spirals. "Honestly," Squidward muttered, staring at the dunes pressing against his doorstep. "Does he think sand has feelings?" SpongeBob, kneeling with furrowed brow and blower in hand, barely looked up. "Good morning, Squidward."
"I'm just finishing the east sweep."
"Won't be long." "It's already too long," Squidward groaned, retreating into his house and slamming the door. But SpongeBob hardly heard. The blower had spoken again, or at least he thought it had. A small sputter, a soft hiss, reminding him that the line he'd drawn near the fence wasn't quite even. He corrected it at once, murmuring, "Thank you. You're right. That's much better." Hours melted away like drifting bubbles. The more he worked, the more the yard gleamed with impossible precision. Strangers passing by sometimes paused, marveling. "Look at that sand," one fish whispered.
So smooth, so clean. It's almost unnatural. SpongeBob would blush, rubbing the back of his neck. "Oh, it's nothing."
Just a little love and care, but in truth it was more than a little. It was nearly all his love, nearly all his care. Patrick came by one afternoon, munching on a sandwich. He watched SpongeBob sweeping the blower in careful arcs. "Hey, buddy," Patrick said through a mouthful of bread. "Want to go jellyfishing?" SpongeBob hesitated, his eyes darting between the blower and his friend. The sand near the garden's edge still looked rough, uneven. "Maybe later," he said gently. "I've got to finish the west patch first." And the spiral.
Then Patrick tilted his head, confused. "But—"
"The sand's already clean." SpongeBob glanced around, seeing only imperfections. "Not quite. Not yet." Patrick shrugged and wandered off. The sound of his laughter faded with distance, replaced by the steady hum of the blower. The yard became, in time, a kind of sanctuary. Flawless, gleaming, untouched by drift or debris. But it was also lonely, for in his devotion to neatness, SpongeBob began to miss things. Patrick's jokes, Squidward's rare moments of kindness, the gentle drift of jellyfish in the late afternoon light. Perfection had become a tide that pulled him away from the simple, messy joys he once cherished. And yet he could not stop. Each time the blower sighed in his hands, he felt a tug, a reminder that there was still work to do, still disorder to set right. At night, lying in bed, he found it hard to sleep. His mind replayed patterns, spirals, arcs. He thought of grains of sand out of place, of seashells left askew. The blower's hum echoed in his ears like a lullaby that soothed and stirred him all at once. One night, he whispered into the dark, "What if it's never finished? What if I can never make it perfect?" The silence answered. Or perhaps it was the reef blower, waiting quietly in the yard, holding its own kind of wisdom. That perfection is not something to be reached, but something to be felt in fleeting moments. But SpongeBob did not yet understand. Not fully. He only knew the hum was calling him again, asking him to rise with the dawn, to smooth and shape the world one grain at a time. And so he dreamed of sand, endless sand, stretching far beyond his little yard, a garden with no end, waiting for his careful hand. The morning was soft, the kind where the light filtered through the ocean as if it had been softened by a dream. SpongeBob was already at work, the reef blower humming steadily in his hands, tracing arcs along the sand. Each movement was deliberate, each sweep a repetition of yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. The sand gleamed like polished glass. Every shell lay precisely where SpongeBob had placed it, no more and no less. It was, to his eyes, nearly perfect. And yet he kept going, adjusting, re-smoothing, chasing flaws that no one else could see. Patrick arrived, as he often did, without warning and without reason. He lumbered into the yard with his easy smile, holding a paper bag that sagged with the weight of something greasy. "Morning, SpongeBob," Patrick said, plopping down on the freshly cleaned sand without hesitation. Crumbs tumbled from the bag, leaving a trail of tiny specks behind him. SpongeBob winced as the blower hummed in his hands.
"Patrick."
The sand. Patrick blinked down at the crumbs. Then he picked one up, squinting.
"Oh, extra decoration."
He popped it into his mouth and grinned. Despite himself, SpongeBob chuckled softly.
"You always see it that way, huh?"
Patrick nodded, mouth full. "Yep, everything looks better with snacks." The blower sputtered, as if disapproving, and SpongeBob carefully shut it off. For the first time that morning, he sat down beside Patrick, folding his hands in his lap. "What are you eating?" he asked. "Sandwiches," Patrick said, pulling out 2 lopsided creations from the bag. He handed one to SpongeBob. The bread was uneven, the lettuce hung out from the sides, and a smear of mustard stained the wrapping. SpongeBob hesitated. It wasn't neat. It wasn't tidy. But Patrick's eyes shone with such simple generosity that he couldn't refuse. He took the sandwich, biting into it slowly. The taste was imperfect. The bread too soft, the lettuce wilting, the cheese unevenly melted. But the warmth of sharing, of sitting shoulder to shoulder in the quiet yard, made it feel like the best thing SpongeBob had eaten all week. "See?" Patrick said proudly. "Perfect!" SpongeBob smiled, chewing thoughtfully. "I guess it is." They ate in silence for a while, crumbs dotting the sand, tiny stains marring the once pristine patterns. SpongeBob's hands itched to reach for the blower to erase the mess. But then Patrick sighed happily, stretching onto his back, arms spread wide. "Don't you love it?" Patrick said, staring up at the drifting light above them.
How the bubbles float all funny. How the sea makes the light wiggle. None of it straight or neat, but it's beautiful anyway. SpongeBob followed his gaze.
Above them, sunlight fractured into ribbons, bending across the water, shimmering without pattern or symmetry. It was messy, yes, but it was also alive. He lay back beside Patrick, feeling the imperfect crumbs press against his shirt. For a long moment he didn't move to brush them away. "You always make things so simple," SpongeBob murmured. Patrick shrugged, still gazing upward. "Simple's easier." "Complicated gives me a headache." SpongeBob laughed, the sound bubbling up like it hadn't in days. They spent the afternoon together, not cleaning, not tidying, but playing. Patrick picked up seashells and stacked them into crooked towers, declaring each one a castle. SpongeBob helped, even when the towers fell apart. They drew shapes in the sand with their fingers, patterns that the tide quickly erased. For once, SpongeBob didn't mind. Later, Patrick began humming a little tune, off-key and half-forgotten. SpongeBob joined in, making up words as he went. Their voices mingled clumsily, filling the air with laughter instead of precision. It struck SpongeBob then how different this feeling was from the endless pursuit of order. With Patrick, there was no perfection.
Only moments.
Fragile, fleeting, but full of life. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the reef, SpongeBob looked at the sand. It was messy now, littered with crumbs, footprints, shells scattered at odd angles. His old self would have rushed for the blower, smoothing it all back into place, but instead he let it be. "It's not perfect," he admitted softly. Patrick smiled, eyes half closed. "Maybe that's why it's perfect." The words lingered in SpongeBob's heart long after Patrick had drifted home. That night, lying in bed, he thought about them again. Maybe perfection wasn't in the flawless sand, the neat spirals, the even lines. Maybe it was in the little crumbs, the crooked castles, the laughter between friends. He closed his eyes, the hum of the blower faint in the back of his mind. But tonight, it wasn't calling him with urgency. Tonight, it was only a lullaby, blending with Patrick's voice in memory. And SpongeBob drifted into sleep with a new thought, soft and fragile. Perhaps the wonder of life was not in getting everything right, but in letting small things, imperfect things, be enough. Silence has many shades. There is the silence of peace, the silence of awe, and the silence of a slammed door. Squidward's silence was the last kind most days, sharp, brittle, carrying the weight of things he would not say. For weeks he had endured the sound of the reef blower. The hum and sputter rattled through his walls, cutting into the quiet hours he reserved for himself and his clarinet. He had tried muttering under his breath, tried groaning loudly through the window, even tried shoving towels into his ears. But SpongeBob remained oblivious, moving through the sand like a priest at his altar, blower in hand, smile as wide as ever. On this particular morning, Squidward opened his blinds to find his yard once again dusted with a fresh coat of sand. SpongeBob had swept his spirals a little too far, and grains lay piled against Squidward's doormat, soft dunes threatening to bury his carefully tended walkway. Squidward stared at it, his jaw tightening. He wanted to shout. He wanted to storm out and demand silence. But when he opened the door, he found SpongeBob kneeling, carefully arranging seashells into a curved line that pointed toward Squidward's house. The sight made Squidward pause. For all the chaos, there was something almost reverent about SpongeBob's movements. Gentle, deliberate, as if he were placing offerings at a shrine. Squidward's throat tightened, but the words caught before they could form. Instead, he sighed, loudly. SpongeBob looked up at once. "Good morning, Squidward."
I made this pattern for you, see?
"It points to your door, like a welcome path."
Squidward pinched the bridge of his nose. "A welcome path made of sand that's now in my house." "Oh," SpongeBob said softly, blinking. I didn't mean for it to get messy. I just thought it might make you smile." Squidward didn't answer.
He turned, retreating into his home. The door closed with a heavy thud, and the silence that followed was heavier still. Inside, Squidward leaned against the wall, staring at his clarinet. He wanted to play, to drown out the hum of the blower and the cheer of his neighbor. But as he lifted the instrument, no sound came. His breath faltered, his fingers stiff. The music refused to move through him. He lowered the clarinet and sat in silence, listening.
Outside, the blower purred.
SpongeBob's laughter carried faintly, punctuated by Patrick's occasional shout of joy, and Squidward, though he would never admit it, felt a pang of something almost like envy. Not for the blower, not for the sand, but for the way SpongeBob seemed to fill his life with endless noise, endless energy, endless presence. Squidward's own life, by contrast, felt like an empty room where echoes disappeared too quickly. Later that afternoon, he ventured outside again. SpongeBob was gone, perhaps inside for lunch, and the yard stood gleaming in perfect patterns. The shells were arranged neatly, the sand smoothed flat. Squidward stepped into it reluctantly, his feet leaving deep prints. He scowled at the marks, yet a small, guilty part of him lingered. The patterns were beautiful in their way. There was symmetry, balance, even artistry. If Squidward had found them in a gallery, he might have admired them. But here, in his front yard, they felt intrusive, like a kindness he hadn't asked for. That evening, SpongeBob knocked at Squidward's door, holding a small shell in his hand.
"I found this while cleaning," he said, voice earnest.
"It reminded me of your clarinet."
"I thought you might like it." Squidward stared at the shell.
It was unremarkable, a little cracked at the edge. He wanted to slam the door. He wanted to say, "I don't need your gifts." But he didn't. Instead, he took the shell quietly, murmured a barely audible, "Thanks, Eat," and closed the door. Inside, he placed the shell on his windowsill. He told himself it was only so SpongeBob wouldn't notice it missing. But later that night, when he played his clarinet, his eyes kept drifting toward it, and he found that his music sounded softer. Sadder, perhaps, but softer. Over the following days, the silence between them grew more complicated. Squidward still groaned when the blower roared. He still muttered insults under his breath. But sometimes, when SpongeBob waved, Squidward would raise a half-hearted hand in return. Sometimes, when the blower sputtered, Squidward found himself listening, as if it were part of the neighborhood's rhythm. And once, late at night, when he stood by the window and saw SpongeBob lying in the sand, humming to himself under the stars, Squidward felt an ache he couldn't name. An ache that came from recognizing something in his neighbor. A persistence, a longing, a refusal to let the world be quiet. That mirrored the ache in himself. Squidward turned away, muttering, "Fool." But the silence that followed was softer than before. It was not acceptance. Not yet, but it was no longer rejection either. It was something in between, a silence that held possibility. There were days when the reef blower slept. It leaned against the wall like an old companion, quiet and waiting, its nozzle lowered as though it too was thinking. SpongeBob found that he no longer needed it as often as before. The yard stayed tidy on its own somehow, as though the sand remembered his touch. A breeze would pass through and scatter the grains into soft patterns, forming ripples that looked almost like waves on the surface. SpongeBob would sit beside the blower and hum quietly, not to wake it, but to keep it company. He thought about how strange it was, that a simple tool had shaped so much of his days. And yet the blower never asked for anything, never demanded thanks.
It only breathed out when he guided it.
Perhaps that was why he loved it so, because in its silence, it reminded him of kindness that asks for nothing in return. On one such afternoon, Patrick wandered by, carrying a seashell he had polished until it gleamed. He plopped down beside SpongeBob without a word. They sat together in silence, the kind that doesn't weigh heavy, but instead feels like a warm blanket spread across the sand. Patrick eventually turned the shell over in his hands and asked, "Do you ever think things—"
"Remember us?"
SpongeBob tilted his head. "What do you mean, buddy?" Patrick shrugged, eyes fixed on the shell. "Like this. Maybe it remembers the ocean waves. Maybe your blower remembers you." The thought settled gently between them.
SpongeBob didn't laugh, didn't dismiss it.
Instead, he whispered, "I hope so.
I hope it remembers that I tried to take care of it."
That I listened when it whistled, even if I didn't understand. Patrick nodded as if SpongeBob had confirmed something he always suspected. Then he leaned back on the sand, staring at the sky where bubbles drifted lazily.
"I think everything remembers love," he murmured. They both let the words drift into the quiet. Later that evening,
when SpongeBob was alone again, he touched the blower with soft fingertips, tracing the curve of its handle. He felt a hum beneath it, or maybe he only imagined it, as if the blower did indeed carry memory, like a seashell echoing the sea. In those moments, SpongeBob realized he wasn't afraid of silence anymore. The emptiness of the night no longer pressed upon him. Instead, silence had become a friend, much like Patrick, much like the blower. It was in the quiet that he heard things he had once missed, the hush of distant tides, the soft crackle of sand shifting, the faint creak of the reef, as if it too were breathing. As he listened, he felt himself soften, as though his whole body had become as porous as his name suggested. He let the world seep through him, and in that gentle openness he understood something simple and profound. We don't have to be loud to leave an imprint. Sometimes the softest touch, the quietest breath, lingers the longest. That night he dreamed of being very small as a single bubble rising through the water. He floated upward, watching the reef blower resting in the sand far below. It did not move, yet he could feel its presence like a steady heartbeat. In the dream, the blower released a sigh, not loud, not startling, but tender, like the exhale of a friend drifting to sleep. SpongeBob woke with tears in his eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when a truth settles deep within you. So deep it overflows. He sat by the window, watching dawn paint the water in streaks of pale gold, and whispered, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the reef blower, to Patrick, or to the world itself. Maybe all of them at once. In the days that followed, SpongeBob found himself giving thanks more often. To the small jellyfish that floated near his pineapple house, to the old coral that gave shade when the sun stretched long, to Squidward even, when Squidward frowned at him for humming too loudly. He began to notice how gratitude softened everything, like warm water washing over rough stone. The reef blower grew quieter still, its hum less frequent. But SpongeBob no longer feared the fading. He knew that even in its silence, it was with him, just as every kindness ever given stays somewhere, glowing softly in the dark, and so he carried on, not waiting for the blower to breathe, but breathing for it. He became the exhale, the soft push, the gentle wind that moved through his own small world. And when the nights grew long and sleep came slowly, he would whisper into the stillness, "Everything remembers love." The words were like a lullaby,
rocking him into dreams. There came a morning when SpongeBob awoke to a silence so complete it felt as though the whole reef was holding its breath.
He lay in bed for a long while, blinking at the ceiling, listening for the familiar hush of water moving, the quiet bubbling of the sea. It was all there, faint as ever, but behind it stretched a deeper stillness, like the pause before a memory surfaces. When he stepped outside, he noticed the reef blower was gone.
Not stolen, not taken.
Simply absent. The space it once filled beside the wall was just sand now, smoothed over as if it had slipped quietly into another place. SpongeBob stood there, heart tilting between worry and wonder, and for the first time he did not rush to fix what was missing. He only breathed in the strangeness of it, letting the absence speak in its own way. Patrick arrived later, carrying a sandwich with far too much jelly, and noticed his friend staring at the empty spot. "Lost something?" he asked through a mouthful. SpongeBob nodded, though his voice came out gentle, almost serene. "The blower isn't here anymore." Patrick tilted his head. "Maybe it went on a walk," SpongeBob smiled faintly. "Maybe." They sat together on the sand, sharing the sandwich in silence. The thought of the reef blower wandering through the ocean, seeking something unseen, made SpongeBob's chest ache in a strangely comforting way. He realized he wasn't sad, not really, just tender. Tender in the way one feels when a dear friend moves far away. Not lost, just elsewhere. In the days that followed, SpongeBob found himself looking less at the ground and more at the sky, as if the blower's breath had taught him to lift his eyes. He noticed how light filtered through the water in wavering streams, painting the reef in shifting gold. He noticed the way bubbles rose and popped like laughter held too long. And he noticed, most of all, how much space remained when something beloved stepped away. Space that asked to be filled not with noise, but with gentle presence. He began walking further than usual, past the jellyfish fields, past the kelp forests, into stretches of sand so wide they seemed like dreams flattened out. Along the way, he hummed the same soft tune he once hummed for the blower, as though carrying its memory in the rhythm of his breath. Sometimes the water seemed to answer, rippling in time with him. One evening, he wandered into a cove he had never noticed before. The walls of coral curved like cupped hands, sheltering a pool that glowed faintly blue. He sat at the edge, dipping his feet into the cool water, and felt something stir inside him. Not sadness, not joy, but a quiet recognition. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere that had been waiting all along. He whispered into the pool, "I don't know if you're out there, blower, but thank you for teaching me to listen. Thank you for teaching me that silence isn't empty." The water rippled gently as though nodding, and in that shimmer, SpongeBob understood that the blower had not truly gone anywhere.
Its breath lingered in him, in the sand, in every soft ripple that moved the sea. The walk back to his pineapple home felt lighter, almost like floating.
He realized he no longer carried only his own steps. He carried the echoes of every moment the blower had taught him, the patience to pause, the grace to listen, the wonder of noticing small things. These were not lessons that vanished with the object itself. They were his now, woven into his days. That night, Patrick came knocking, bringing a star-shaped pillow he insisted was perfect for dreaming. They sprawled out together, gazing at the ceiling where shadows shifted like waves. Patrick mumbled, "I think things only leave when they know you can keep going without them." SpongeBob closed his eyes, letting the words sink in like soft sand between toes. "I think you're right," he whispered. They drifted into sleep, side by side, the room filled with the sound of their steady breathing. SpongeBob dreamed again of Bubbles, but this time he was not rising alone. He floated with countless others, drifting together toward a vast, quiet sky. Among them, he thought he heard the softest sigh, familiar and kind, like an old friend saying good night. And when he woke at dawn, he did not search the corner where the reef blower once rested. Instead, he went outside, stood beneath the slow brightening of the sea, and whispered into the water, "I'll carry you with me. Always." The words settled in the morning stillness like a promise kept. The seasons in the ocean did not change as they did above the waves, yet SpongeBob began to notice rhythms all the same. Days stretched and folded into one another like soft fabric. Jellyfish drifted in larger flocks, their movements like lanterns crossing the night. Even Squidward's clarinet sounded different, still mournful, but tinged with something quieter, as if the whole reef was settling into reflection. SpongeBob found himself looking backward as much as forward. He would sit on the porch of his pineapple house, legs dangling, and think about the boy he once was. The boy who had first pulled the reef blower into his arms, struggling to understand its strange power. He remembered his fumbling, the sandstorms he accidentally caused, the way neighbors grumbled as their lawns filled with swirls, and he smiled, because even in those mistakes there had been a seed of wonder. Now, years later, he felt gentler inside, as if all that blowing and breathing had carved space in him. Not hollowness, but room. A wide, patient room where love could linger. One evening, he invited Patrick to sit with him beneath the glow of the rising moon jellyfish. The two friends watched them drift across the reef like living stars. SpongeBob said softly, "Do you ever wonder what we'll leave behind, Patrick?" Patrick blinked, munching on a cookie he had somehow produced from nowhere.
Like crumbs?
SpongeBob laughed quietly, shaking his head.
No, like memories.
"The things people carry of us after we're gone," Patrick chewed thoughtfully, then replied, "I think..."
People remember how you made them feel. Like, I'll remember your laugh.
"And how you always share your sandwiches, even when you don't want to." The simplicity of Patrick's answer settled into SpongeBob's heart with surprising weight. It was true. No one would measure his life by tidy sand or tidy yards. They would remember the warmth in his laughter, the gentleness in his hands, the way he hummed when the world grew too quiet. Later that night, SpongeBob wrote in his journal, a simple book with uneven edges where ink often smudged. He wrote not of chores or lists, but of feelings. He wrote, "Kindness is the only thing that doesn't sink."
It floats, the reef blower had taught him that.
Each gust of its breath had been both presence and absence, clearing space, leaving quiet. It had shown him that the most powerful forces were unseen: air, silence, memory, love. And now, with it gone, SpongeBob realized he had become something of a blower himself. He was no longer simply cleaning sand. He was clearing small corners of the world with every soft act, making room for light to seep in. In the days that followed, he began to visit old places, the playground, where he once played tag with jellyfish, the shallow tide pools where he first learned to listen for the sound of shells, even the far edge of the reef where the water darkened into mystery. At each place he paused, breathed, and gave thanks. Sometimes he whispered aloud, other times he only thought it. But always he left a little part of himself there, like a gentle breath pressed into memory. and the reef seemed to remember. At the playground, a swing moved even without current, creaking softly as though waving to him. In the tide pools, the shells rang faintly, like distant bells. At the edge of the reef, where silence pressed heavy, he thought he heard the faintest sigh of the blower. Not in fear, not in loss, but in reassurance. When he returned home, Squidward was sitting on his own porch, staring into the water as though trying to find something long forgotten. SpongeBob almost passed by, but something tugged at him. He stopped, sat down beside Squidward, and said nothing. Minutes passed before Squidward muttered, "Do you ever feel like time just
slips through your hands?"
SpongeBob nodded gently. "All the time. But I think the best things don't slip. They stay even when you can't see them." Squidward didn't reply, but he didn't get up either. They sat together as the night deepened, two very different souls sharing the same stillness. SpongeBob realized then that legacy wasn't grand or loud. Sometimes it was as quiet as this. Two neighbors breathing the same water, finding comfort without words as the night grew darker. SpongeBob whispered a thought that had been blooming inside him. Maybe the reef blower left so I could learn to carry the silence myself. The words surprised him, but they felt true. For the first time, he was no longer waiting for it to return. He was living as though it had always been part of him. And in that living, he felt a gentle strength, not the strength of force, but the strength of peace. Before sleep that night, SpongeBob stepped outside once more. He looked up at the drifting jellyfish, glowing softly as if lit from within.
"Everything remembers love," he murmured again,
repeating the phrase Patrick had once said. And as he lay down to rest, he felt as though the whole reef remembered him too. Not with noise, not with applause, but with a silence so tender it rocked him toward dreams. There was a hush in the days that followed,
as though the sea itself had slowed down to listen.
Even the jellyfish moved with unhurried grace, their glowing tendrils drifting like ribbons through the dim blue. SpongeBob felt that he too was moving differently now. He no longer hurried to sweep every corner or fuss over every speck of sand. He allowed things to be as they were, imperfect yet whole, and he discovered a softer rhythm in the letting go. The reef blower had been gone for some time, yet its presence had not faded. If anything, it had deepened. SpongeBob felt it when the tide shifted, when a bubble rose unbidden from the ground, when a sudden breeze brushed across his face. These small moments felt like whispers, not of a machine, but of memory itself. The blower had become less an object and more a language, a way of noticing the world. One afternoon, SpongeBob visited the quiet cove again, the one with the glowing blue pool. He sat by the water, dipping his feet into the cool depths, and spoke softly as though to an old friend. "I used to think I needed you here to feel whole, but now I understand. You showed me that I already had the breath inside me, waiting to be used kindly." The words floated on the surface, carried away by ripples, and SpongeBob smiled. It wasn't sadness he felt, but gratitude, the kind that lingers like warmth after the sun has set. On his way home, he passed by Squidward's house. The windows glowed faintly, and through them he could hear the soft strains of clarinet. The melody was hesitant, searching, but not unhappy. SpongeBob paused, listening, and thought, everyone has their own kind of blower, their own strange way of shaping silence into meaning. For Squidward it was music. For Patrick it was laughter. For SpongeBob himself it was breath. He began to see the reef differently, as though it were alive with quiet legacies. The coral held the memories of fish who once darted between its branches. The shells whispered with the voices of tides long past. Even the sand seemed to glow faintly with the footprints of friends who had walked there before. The world was full of echoes, each one proof that nothing truly vanished. That evening, Patrick arrived carrying a lantern made from a hollow shell. He placed it in the sand, and the soft glow spread across the yard. For when nights feel too dark, Patrick explained, scratching his head. SpongeBob's eyes warmed. Thank you, buddy.
That's beautiful. They sat together, watching the lantern flicker.
SpongeBob thought of how love always found a way to leave traces, in a gift, in a song, in the memory of shared silence. He realized that these traces were not just for the ones left behind. They were for the givers too, reminders that they had lived, that they had given something of themselves to the world. Later that night, lying in bed, SpongeBob let his mind drift through the corridors of memory. He remembered being small, frightened of the vast sea, until the reef blower had taught him that even small breaths could shape the world. He remembered the way Patrick had listened without judgment, the way Squidward had, in his own quiet way, shared space with him. These were the true treasures of his life. Not objects, but bonds, not possessions, but echoes. As he dozed, he dreamed of walking through a meadow of sand where every grain shimmered faintly. Each one seemed to hold a tiny reflection of his life, his laughter, his tears, his moments of stillness. The reef blower appeared in the distance, not as a machine, but as a figure woven of wind and light. It did not speak. It only breathed, and its breath lifted the shimmering grains into the sky until they looked like stars. When SpongeBob woke, the dream still clung to him like a gentle mist. He rose slowly, touched the lantern Patrick had given him, and whispered, "We all leave light behind." The day moved forward quietly.
He didn't need to rush it.
He didn't need to seek anything new. He simply lived. Cooking breakfast, humming to himself, greeting Squidward even when Squidward only sighed in response. Each small act felt like a continuation of something larger, a thread in a tapestry he could not yet see in full. That evening, as the reef darkened into its midnight hues, SpongeBob stood outside once more, looking up at the water above him. The stars beyond the waves seemed faint but present, like promises too far away to touch, but near enough to guide. He thought of the reef blower, of Patrick, of Squidward, of every soft kindness that had shaped him, and he felt certain that nothing was ever truly gone. "Everything remembers love," he whispered again, as though sealing the thought into the night. The sea replied not with words, but with a long, gentle current brushing against him like a hand across his shoulder. He closed his eyes, letting it carry him into stillness, and in that stillness he realized that legacy was not about being remembered loudly. It was about being remembered gently in the quiet corners of another's heart. With that, he went inside, blew out the lantern, and drifted toward dreams. A little more at peace, a little more certain that his small life was woven into something vast and kind. The reef was quiet when SpongeBob woke, as though the sea itself had chosen to speak in whispers. He lingered in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling where faint patterns of light swam across his room. The silence did not weigh heavy. It rested around him like a soft quilt,
stitched with memories of every breath, every kindness,
every quiet moment that had shaped his life so far. He rose slowly, padding to the door of his pineapple house, and stepped out into the morning. The water shimmered with muted colors, a palette of blues and golds blending like watercolor. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that told him something was shifting. Not in a way that frightened, but in a way that invited him to pause. Patrick was already waiting outside, holding 2 mugs of seaweed tea. He handed one to SpongeBob without a word, and together they sat on the porch, sipping. The tea was warm and earthy, grounding. SpongeBob thought of how many mornings had passed in laughter, how many in work, and how many simply in being. Today felt like one of the last kind. "A day not to do, but to remember," Patrick eventually said. "Do you think we'll always be here, SpongeBob?" The question hung in the water. SpongeBob looked at his friend, at the way Patrick's eyes carried both innocence and something deeper, something like quiet wonder. "Not always," SpongeBob replied softly. "But I think, even when we're gone, the things we've shared will stay." Patrick nodded, his big hands cradling the mug carefully.
Like bubbles?
"They pop, but you remember how they shined." SpongeBob smiled, his chest aching with affection. "Yes, exactly like that." They sat until their mugs were empty, then leaned back, watching bubbles rise lazily toward the unseen surface. SpongeBob found himself thinking of the reef blower again. Not in longing this time, but in gratitude. It had been a companion, a teacher, a mirror. It had come into his life with mystery and left just as quietly. But what mattered was the space it had left inside him. Space for love, for silence, for wonder. Later that day, SpongeBob walked alone through the reef, letting his feet carry him without direction. He visited the jellyfish fields where the creatures floated like drifting lanterns. He visited the kelp forest where the fronds swayed in slow rhythms like dancers moving to an ancient song. At each place he lingered, breathed, and remembered. He remembered laughter, mistakes, small acts of kindness. He remembered the way Patrick had believed in him without question, the way Squidward had tolerated him even in irritation, the way the reef blower had hummed in his hands like a secret heartbeat. These memories did not weigh him down. They lifted him like bubbles rising. As evening approached, he returned home and found Squidward sitting outside his own house, clarinet resting across his lap. The two exchanged a quiet nod. Neither spoke at first, and SpongeBob realized that was enough. They did not need words to share the moment. Finally, Squidward said almost reluctantly, "You've changed. You're quieter." SpongeBob chuckled softly. "Maybe I finally learned to listen." Squidward didn't reply, but he didn't frown either. That, SpongeBob thought, was Squidward's way of saying he understood. Night came gently, with the reef glowing in shades of indigo and violet. SpongeBob lit Patrick's lantern and placed it on the porch. Its glow spread softly, filling the yard with warmth. He sat cross-legged before it, hands folded in his lap, and let the silence surround him. He thought about legacy again, not as something grand, but as something small and tender.
A laugh that someone carries with them.
A song that lingers after the player is gone. A breath that clears space for someone else to feel at ease. These were the true marks left behind, and they required no monument, no applause. SpongeBob closed his eyes and whispered, "I hope I've given enough of myself to be remembered kindly." The sea responded with a gentle current that brushed against his cheek, like a reassuring hand. He breathed deeply, letting it wash through him. As sleep began to call, he found himself drifting into a dream. He stood once more in the shimmering meadow of sand, where every grain glowed faintly with memory. The reef blower appeared at the horizon not as a machine, but as a figure woven of light and wind. It did not approach, nor did it fade. It simply breathed, and the meadow shimmered brighter. SpongeBob felt no urge to reach for it. He only placed his hand over his heart and breathed in time with its rhythm. And in that moment, he understood. The reef blower had never truly left.
It lived in every breath he took, every kindness he gave, every quiet moment he cherished. He woke with the dream still warm in his chest.
The lantern flickered softly beside him, Patrick snoring faintly in the distance, Squidward's clarinet resting in silence across the reef. And SpongeBob smiled because he knew he was not alone. He never had been. The reef remembered. The world remembered.
Everything remembers love. With that thought,
he closed his eyes again and drifted into sleep, letting the silence carry him gently toward dreams. The reef grew quieter with each passing day, not because life had diminished, but because SpongeBob had learned to hear its softer rhythms. The laughter of jellyfish still chimed across the fields. Squidward's clarinet still sighed through the water. Patrick's voice still tumbled in its cheerful simplicity. Yet beneath all these sounds lay a steady hush, a heartbeat of silence that felt as though the sea itself was exhaling. SpongeBob began to notice how everything carried echoes. The lantern Patrick had given him glowed faintly even when he hadn't lit it. Squidward's clarinet lingered in the air long after the final note faded. Even SpongeBob's own laughter sometimes surprised him, sounding like the echo of every laugh he had shared before. Life, he realized, was not a series of moments disappearing one after another. It was a weaving, a tapestry, where every thread shimmered in the light of memory. One afternoon, SpongeBob walked to the edge of the reef where the water deepened into a darker shade of blue. He stood there for a long while, toes in the sand, watching the horizon blur into mystery. He whispered to the water, "I don't need to see you anymore to know you're here." The sea stirred, sending a soft current across his feet. It felt like agreement. It felt like the reef blower itself had answered, not with words, but with the kind of understanding only silence can give. When he returned home, Patrick was waiting with a basket of sandwiches. They sat on the porch together, eating slowly, crumbs drifting into the water like tiny stars. Patrick said, "Do you think we'll be remembered, SpongeBob?" SpongeBob looked at him tenderly. "We already are, Patrick. Every time we share a sandwich, every time we sit like this, the world remembers. Not in big ways. In quiet ones." Patrick chewed thoughtfully, then grinned. "That's good."
Quiet remembering sounds nice, SpongeBob smiled back. It did sound nice.
Quieter, perhaps, but truer. That night, as the lantern glowed beside him, SpongeBob began to write again in his journal. His words came slowly, but they came steady. Love leaves its shape in the silence, and silence carries it forward. He closed the journal and let the thought sit within him, warm and sure. He did not need anyone else to read it. The act of writing was enough. It was like leaving a footprint in the sand. Even if the tide washed it away, the act of walking there had mattered. In the days that followed, SpongeBob found himself giving more attention to small gestures. He waved to neighbors even when they looked away. He hummed when he cooked, so the walls of his pineapple house would carry the tune. He even placed seashells on the windowsill, not for decoration, but as small gifts to the passing tide. Squidward noticed, though he never said so. His clarinet grew gentler, less sharp, as though something in SpongeBob's quietness had softened his own. Patrick noticed too, though his noticing was simpler. "You've been smiling more," he said one day, holding a dripping ice cream cone. SpongeBob only laughed and nodded. The reef noticed as well. On evenings when SpongeBob sat alone by the shore, the current seemed to bend toward him, brushing his arms like a comfort. The jellyfish swirled closer, their tendrils glowing softly as though recognizing him. Even the sand sparkled faintly, like it had stored bits of his laughter. It was in those evenings that SpongeBob began to understand something he had only glimpsed before. Endings were not final. They were transformations, like bubbles popping into the air or stars fading into dawn. The reef blower had not left. It had transformed into memory, into rhythm, into breath that lived on through him. And one day, he too would transform, leaving behind not objects but echoes of kindness. One night, as the sea darkened into violet and indigo, SpongeBob whispered into the water, "When I go,
I hope someone remembers that I loved them."
that I tried to be gentle, that I listened. The sea answered with a soft sway, and in that sway he felt held. He leaned back, eyes closing, heart light. Patrick's lantern flickered, casting ripples of gold across the sand. Squidward's clarinet played faintly in the distance, weaving into the hush of waves. And SpongeBob thought, this is legacy. Not a monument, not a story shouted loud. Just this. A lantern, a note, a sigh of water. He fell asleep that night with a sense of completion, though not of finality. Life was not closing, only softening. He dreamed of the meadow of glowing sand once again. The reef blower was there, but now it no longer stood apart. It breathed through everything, through the grains, through the light, through him. When he woke, the dream lingered. He placed his hand over his heart and whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time, he felt no difference between himself and the silence around him. They were one. The days drifted forward like gentle tides, carrying SpongeBob into a season of stillness. The reef no longer seemed to pull him outward with urgency. Instead, it drew him inward toward a quiet kind of peace. The meadow of glowing sand that had once lived only in his dreams now felt like it was everywhere, woven into every current, folded into every pause, humming softly beneath the world. Each morning, SpongeBob would wake before the reef had fully stirred. He would sit at his window and watch the slow bloom of light as the sun filtered down through the water. The beams painted shifting patterns across his walls, like an ancient language spoken only in brightness and shadow. He no longer felt the need to chase the day. Simply being present as it arrived was enough. Patrick often joined him in these quiet mornings. He would stumble in with half-closed eyes, clutching a blanket like a child. Sometimes they spoke, but more often they just sat together in silence. Patrick would lean his head against the wall, SpongeBob against the window, and the two of them would breathe in rhythm with the tide. Nothing needed to be said. Friendship, at its deepest, was simply shared presence. Squidward, too, had softened. He no longer scolded SpongeBob for singing or bustling outside his house. Instead, he had begun to let his clarinet float through the reef like a prayer. The music had changed, less sharp, less heavy. It was as though he, too, had been listening to the silence SpongeBob had found. Each note seemed to understand that it would fade, yet it played with more sincerity because of it. SpongeBob carried all of this within him. He no longer clung to the memory of the reef blower as though it were a thing that could be lost. He realized now that it had never been lost at all. It had only changed shape, shifting from an object into a lesson, and from a lesson into a way of being. One evening, he took Patrick and Squidward with him to the far edge of the reef. The horizon lay wide and dark, the sea stretching into mystery. SpongeBob sat in the sand and his friends sat beside him. For a long time, none of them spoke. The silence wrapped around them, steady and full, not empty, but abundant. At last, SpongeBob whispered, "Do you feel it?" Patrick tilted his head. "The water." Squidward sighed, though not unkindly. "The quiet," SpongeBob nodded. "Yes, the quiet. It's always been here."
I just didn't know how to listen before. They let the stillness settle.
A school of glowing fish passed by, scattering flecks of silver light. The water swayed gently as though cradling them. For a brief moment, it felt as though the whole reef was breathing with them. Every coral, every fish, every grain of sand. That night, when SpongeBob returned home, he lit Patrick's lantern and opened his journal one final time. He did not write about endings or goodbyes. Instead, his words were simple, carried on the same current that had carried him through this journey. The reef blower has become silence. The silence has become memory.
And memory has become love. Nothing is ever gone.
It only changes into something softer. He closed the journal and placed it by the lantern. Then he sat back, breathing deeply, letting the silence hold him. The next morning came quietly, as though the sea itself was tiptoeing. SpongeBob moved through his routine slowly, watering his little sea anemones, tidying the corners of his house, humming softly as he cooked breakfast. But everything felt like a farewell, though not a sad one. It was as though the world was bowing gently, not closing a door, but dimming a light so that rest could arrive. Patrick stopped by with a smile. Squidward played his clarinet one last time that day, and the reef bustled in its ordinary way. Yet SpongeBob carried within him a stillness that made even ordinary things shimmer. He felt that if he listened closely, he could hear eternity folded into the rhythm of the waves. That evening, he walked once more to the meadow of glowing sand in his dreams, or perhaps it was no longer only a dream. The sand shone faintly under the moonlight, casting the world in a gentle silver glow. And there, in the hush, he felt the presence of the reef blower not as a thing, but as a breath that touched everything. He whispered,
"Thank you for teaching me how to listen." The silence shimmered.
and in it he felt a reply, "You have always known how. You only needed to remember." SpongeBob lay back on the sand, eyes half closed, the lantern glowing faintly beside him. The sea cradled him in its eternal rhythm. Patrick's laughter, Squidward's clarinet, the hush of the tide, all of it blended together, soft and slow, until there was no distinction between them and the silence. The world exhaled, and SpongeBob exhaled with it, and so the story drifted into quiet. Not ended, not finished, simply carried forward, like a wave rolling into the horizon, like a breath fading into rest. The reef shimmered, the lantern flickered, and the silence grew wide enough to hold everything. Good night.